Hello. Today I'm going to give you an introduction to psychology in order that you can better analyze Adolf Hitler for your Hitler art projects. To begin with, we're going to start with the father of modern psychology, Sigmund Freud, pictured here. Freud is Viennese and lived from 1856 to 1939. Freud pioneered the study of the subconscious and unconscious in psychology, and one of his greatest contributions is the conception of the id, the ego, and the superego. So to begin with, all of us, according to Freud, are born with an id. And that's really, as far as our personality is concerned, all we're born with. Essentially, the id is what we have in common with our ape-like ancestors, according to Freud. And the id tells us and drives us to seek pleasure and to avoid pain. And this is essentially why a baby doesn't really care about you when you're taking care of it. A baby, when it wants something, it cries until it gets it, and it stops when it's done. Essentially, a baby, according to Freud, with an id, doesn't really even understand that it exists separately from you, the caregiver. As the caregiver, you really represent just a mechanism to fulfill the baby's instinctual needs. So the id, as we move on in life, is represented here in this picture of our pal Adolf Hitler, and of course I mean that facetiously, as the devil. And the id is always whispering into our ear as we make decisions from moment to moment, and it's whispering for us to do what feels the best and to avoid what feels the worst. So as we begin to age, or as we age, and we hit about the age of 3, 4, or 5, and we start to form memories, we begin to develop an ego. The ego is what Freud referred to as the reality principle. And the ego is the part of our personality which is conscious. It is us. It's the part of you that is looking out your eyes and listening to this presentation right now. And the ego is what continuously has to make active decisions about what to do from moment to moment. And with the development of the ego, we first understand that we are separate from other individuals and that at times we may have to do things that we don't necessarily like to do. So the ego here will be represented by Hitler, the decision maker. And finally, we have the superego, and this is the last part of the personality to develop according to Freud. The superego represents our moral principle, and it's initially put into our minds by our parents or our caregivers. And essentially the superego is what tells us that certain things are good and certain things are bad, or certain things are right and certain things are wrong. And so the superego is represented over here by this angel sitting on Hitler's shoulder and whispering into his ear that he should make moral decisions. And so as we go from moment to moment in our lives, our egos have to make decisions. And so Hitler here has to make a decision about what he wants to do, whether he wants to attack Russia, whether he wants to create the Holocaust, whether he wants to strengthen Germany, etc., etc. And as Hitler's trying to decide, he has at least two voices whispering into his head. He has the voice of his id, which tells him to do whatever feels good in the moment and to continuously avoid pain. And he has the superego over here always telling him that he should make the morally correct choice and avoid doing anything evil. And so, of course, from our perspective now, Hitler most likely always listened to his id, because as we sit here, we look back on what Hitler's done and realize that he's committed atrocities and assume that it must be because he was listening to his pleasure principle. And pleasure in this case was represented by what Freud would call thanatos, and that's thanatos. And that is our instinctual desire to destroy and to protect. Thanatos, here it is written a little bit more legibly for you. On the other hand, if one looks at Hitler's actions in light of the morality of his day and considering how rampant anti-Semitism was and how rampant anti-communism was in light of the recent Russian Revolution, one could also argue that Hitler, when he committed all his atrocities, was listening to his superego, because socially it was acceptable not only to be anti-Semitic, but to also start wars to strengthen Germany, which is what Hitler did. And so, as you create your Hitler psychological analysis, you can pick different actions that he took and judge, in your opinion, was Hitler operating on his id, or was he in fact operating on his superego? And there are no wrong answers here, as long as you can support your analysis with some factual data. Moving on to our next extremely important figure and idea in modern psychology, we have behaviorism. And behaviorism is created by the psychologist B.F. Skinner, who lived from 1904 to 1990. And behaviorism essentially was created, in part anyway, as a reaction to Freud. Freud seemed to think that many of the things that we did came from instinctual, ape-like, if you will, desires that we couldn't really understand. And Freud also suggested that when people had psychological problems, that one had to delve into the unconscious mind using things like Rorschach tests, those are those ink blot tests, or using hypnosis. And Skinner listens to all this and he says, no, he says, wait a minute, people operate based on the same principles that we train animals. And he creates this idea of operant conditioning. And quite simply, it says that people learn through rewards and punishments. And if you want to understand why people commit certain acts, look at how they were rewarded for those acts in the past. And so, based on B.F. Skinner's behavioristic model, one could argue that Hitler was truly rewarded by two things in his life. One is his life in the military. And here we see Hitler with all his pals in World War I. And Hitler was actually awarded a medal in World War I for bravery. And it was some of the happiest moments of his life. Also, Hitler received many awards, social awards, lots of applause, lots of approbation for leading the Nazi Party. Here's Hitler right here. You can see his little mustache. So here's Hitler pictured at an early meeting in the Nazi Party where he was extremely popular. And so based on his rewards for being a soldier in war and based on his rewards for being a political leader of the Nazi Party, Hitler continued on that path as a politician and a promoter of war and violence. On the other hand, Skinner would teach us that Hitler was punished for his other pursuit in life, his other love in life, which was art. As many people know, Hitler, really more than anything else, wanted to be an artist. Sadly, arguably for all of humanity, Hitler was rejected from the Vienna School of Art because he couldn't draw portraits very well. So if we want to analyze Hitler from the behaviorist model, we would look at the things in life that Hitler was rewarded for and how that influences his later actions, and the things in life that he was punished for and how that influences his later actions. Next on our list of important ideas in psychology, we have humanism, or humanistic psychology. And humanistic psychology is pioneered most famously by a man named Abraham Maslow. And Maslow lives from 1908 to 1910, and is most famous for his idea of the hierarchy of needs. And Maslow is in opposition to Skinner and behaviorism, and in opposition to Freud and psychoanalysis. And Maslow says, no, people aren't animals that need to be trained with rewards and punishments, and people aren't driven by unconscious desires based on childhood memories that we can't even remember. He says, no. In fact, people are individuals capable of achieving their own unique potential, and can only do this if several other psychological needs are met. And here we have the introduction of Maslow's hierarchy of needs represented here and you can find many triangular charts like this, by Maslow's hierarchy. And essentially it says we start at the bottom with physiological needs that must be met, and as our needs are met, we can progress up the triangle. So I just want to give you a second. I know there's a lot of words on this picture, and I don't want to talk at the same time as you're reading, so I'm just going to pause for about 10 seconds here, 15 seconds, and give you a chance to read each of these steps, and then I'll go over them with you. Okay, so we start with the physiological, which essentially means physical. And when we're born, the first things we need are air to breathe, food, water, shelter, right? And notice sex is also listed under physiological needs, and of course babies don't need sex, but as people age, Maslow would argue that sex is actually a physiological need. We're driven to have sex, or else we wouldn't reproduce and we would die as a species, which makes sense. So, if we have all of our physiological needs met, then we can move on to safety needs, or safety and security needs. And essentially this means that we have to feel safe at home. That's a simple way to say it. We have to have a secure home life that is the same day after day and is stable. And if we have this, and most folks do, if we have this, then we can move along quickly to love and belongingness. And love and belongingness essentially means we want to be loved and we want to receive love. And we can give and receive love in our family, generally first, and then in our group of friends. And as we age, we also are looking for some sort of intimate sexual partners, which is another form of love and belongingness. We all want that, Maslow would argue. And if we have these things, then essentially we feel the need to have some sort of achievement in life, esteem. And esteem generally is reached by most folks in modern society originally in school. We want esteem from our parents, and we want a pat on the back for when we do good things, but generally speaking, we must have some kind of success in school, or else we'll end up depressed, not believing we can accomplish things, and it will make it very difficult to lead a fully functional life. And so in school, we want to find at least some niche where we can have success. It can be academics, it can be athletics, it can be art, which was Hitler's big idea, but it didn't work out so well for him. If we have all of these needs met here, then we can move on to the big one at the top, which is self-actualization. And self-actualization essentially means achieving our own unique potential. And we do that through an understanding of morality, through being creative, through feeling comfortable acting spontaneously to solve problems. And Maslow would argue that true self-actualization only exists when we have no prejudices driving us to particular behaviors. And so we have an open mind about the world, the way it really is, and we have truly developed some self-knowledge which will allow us to look for that one thing that we were sort of meant to do. So what does this have to do with Hitler? Now right off the bat, we have a problem here with self-actualization indicating a lack of prejudice. So one could argue, as I imagine Maslow would, that Hitler could not be self-actualized because he was so fueled by hatred of the Jews and the communists. And one could also argue that what Hitler really wanted was some esteem needs. He wanted to be successful as an artist and to feel success in the eyes of his father, which is also something that he never did, as you've read in your packet. On the other hand, one could also look at Hitler's accomplishments in strengthening Germany and how he truly created some groundbreaking ideas in the psychology of politics. One could make the argument that Hitler had in fact realized his own unique potential, no matter how horrifying it was for the rest of the world. And once again, as you create your psychological and artistic evaluation of Hitler, it is your choice. And so you can say that he was never self-actualized, You can say that he was self-actualized, or you could represent Hitler either getting or receiving, or getting or not getting any of these other needs: esteem, loving belongingness, safety needs, or physiological needs. And there's examples of all of these things in your reading about Hitler. Finally, we have existential philosophy. And existential philosophy is created by this gentleman, Viktor Frankl. Viktor Frankl, interestingly, as far as Hitler is concerned, and Viktor Frankl died not too long ago in 1997, but as far as Hitler is concerned, Viktor Frankl was a Holocaust survivor, a concentration camp survivor. He was an extremely renowned psychologist in Germany, but because he was a Jew, he was condemned to live in a concentration camp. And in the concentration camp, Frankl actually writes what I think is a 1,000-page book secretly on scraps of paper that he hides under the floorboards near where he sleeps. And sadly, after spending a year writing this, the Nazis find his manuscript and they burn it in front of him. And so at this point, Viktor Frankl hits a new low psychologically. And this drives him eventually to an epiphany. And what Frankl realizes is that what keeps people alive, and this is what kept people alive in the concentration camp, was an ability to make meaning out of your life no matter what the circumstances are. And this idea of creating your own meaning is a cornerstone of existential thought. And what Frankl observed was most of the victims in the concentration camps were equally starved, equally emaciated, equally abused. But for some reason, some of them died and some of them lived. And Frankl watched who died and who lived, and particularly he has an epiphany watching people dig graves. And the people who ended up living were the folks that actually focused on digging the best grave possible. They created meaning even in the horrifying situation they were in. And by focusing on that accomplishment of digging graves, those folks were able to survive until the Nazis were eventually defeated. And so Frankl's psychology says that at our base, we all have a will to make meaning in our lives, the will to meaning. And I believe that his phrasing of this, the will to meaning, is a juxtaposition against Nietzsche's idea of a will to power. And Nietzsche's will to power was a favorite ideology of many preeminent Nazis. And so Viktor Frankl takes this in another direction and says, well, it's not really about power, it's about making meaning out of your life. And so perhaps in analyzing Hitler, Frankl would say that Hitler's real meaning in life was art. And here we see this in Hitler's paintings. And this is a painting by Hitler. And as you can see, Hitler was in fact quite a good artist. And this is why he wanted to pursue this idea. But after Hitler is rejected from the Vienna School of Art and rejected by Jews on the board, Hitler channels his inability to make meaning into an intense hatred for Jews and communists, leading him to start the Second World War and create the Holocaust. And by the way, this is not a picture by Hitler. It's a picture of Hitler. And so if we're looking at Hitler's desire to make meaning, again, as you choose your subject matter in your Hitler psychological art project, you can say that Hitler either could not make meaning because he could not be an artist, and that was his purpose, that's what made him happy in life. Or you could say that maybe Hitler really wasn't born to be an artist, that Hitler was born to be a political leader. And therefore, by creating the Third German Empire, albeit unsuccessfully and through horrifying strategies, Hitler was in fact able to make meaning. So there again, each of these psychologists, your Freudian, your behavioristic, your humanistic, and your existential, give you a couple of possibilities to choose what you really believe was behind Hitler's actions. And so as you practice a little bit of psychology here, you want to look at Hitler's life and then think, what do you really think it was that drove Hitler to make the decisions that he did, and then represent these in art. all of the pictures used in this are either in Wikimedia Commons and with their attribution requirements fulfilled here, or a few of them are just in the public domain and are free to anybody to use. So thank you very much for listening to my presentation about Hitler, and good luck with your Hitler psychological art projects. Hello. Today I'm going to give you an introduction to psychology in order that you can better analyze Adolf Hitler for your Hitler art projects. To begin with, we're going to start with the father of modern psychology, Sigmund Freud, pictured here. Freud is Viennese and lived from 1856 to 1939. Freud pioneered the study of the subconscious. We may have to do things that we don't necessarily like to do. So the ego here will be represented by Hitler, the decision maker. And finally, we have the superego, and this is the last part of the personality to develop according to Freud. The superego represents our moral principle, and it's initially put into our minds by our parents or our caregivers, and essentially the superego is what tells us that certain things are good and certain things are bad, or certain things are right and certain things are wrong. And so the superego is represented over here by this angel sitting on Hitler's shoulder, and gets it, and it stops when it's done. Essentially, a baby, according to Freud, with an id, doesn't really even understand that it exists separately from you, the caregiver. As the caregiver, you really represent just a mechanism to fulfill the baby's instinctual needs. So the id, as we move on in life, is represented here in this picture of our pal Adolf Hitler, and of course I mean that facetiously, as the devil. And the id is always whispering into our ear as we make decisions from moment to moment, and it's whispering for us to do what feels the best and to avoid what feels the worst. So as we begin to age, or as we age, and we hit about the age of 3, 4, or 5, and we start to form memories, we begin to develop an ego. The ego is what Freud referred to as the reality principle. And the ego is the part of our personality which is conscious. It is us. It's the part of you that is looking out your eyes and listening to this presentation right now. And the ego is what continuously has to make active decisions about what to do from moment to moment. And with the development of the ego, we first understand that we are separate from other individuals, and that at times it's an unconscious in psychology. And one of his greatest contributions is the conception of the id, the ego, and the superego. So to begin with, all of us, according to Freud, are born with an id. And that's really, as far as our personality is concerned, all we're born with. Essentially, the id is what we have in common with our ape-like ancestors, according to Freud. And the id tells us and drives us to seek pleasure and to avoid pain. And this is essentially why a baby doesn't really care about you when you're taking care of it. A baby, when it wants something, it cries until it